Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today, I'm interviewing Dr. Poppy S. Winanti about her analysis brief that she wrote for us recently. Poppy is senior lecturer, at the International Relations Department at the Universitas Gadjah Mada in Yogyakarta in Indonesia. She's also one of our Indo-Pacific Fellows. Her areas of research include global and regional trade relations, global political economy, conflict and the political economy of natural resources and extractive industries, and Indonesia's economic diplomacy. Thank you for joining us today, Poppy.
Thanks, Kyle.
Before we turn to your analysis piece, there's been one very, very important development in Australia-Indonesia relations that we should discuss. We now have an entry into force date of July 5th for the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, IACEPA. Always a bit of a mouthful, but I would like to call it IACEPA for short. So my first question for you is, what do you think about this development? And why do you see it as important for Indonesia?
Good to see you again, Kyle. I know even though it's only virtually, thank you for having me here. And very nice introduction. I'm a little bit like embarrassed with that. Anyway, and then thank you for having me to discuss my latest analysis brief that I prepare for the center. And in responding to your first question, I guess after like 10 months of ratification process, the two countries are officially done with their domestic procedures, right? And as for Indonesia, the ratification process was completed with the adoption of the law of the implementation of the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership as the national law on the 28th of February 2020. And as agreed, as you also mentioned earlier, that the agreement will be getting into force after like 60 days of the ratification, which will be on the 5th of July. I should mention that this agreement is very important for Indonesia for a number of reasons, yeah, both in terms of the trades and also investment. The first thing is the agreement offers market access for the Indonesian products with zero tariff to Australian market, particularly for some important sort of like goods and sectors, including like automotive, furniture, textile, electronics, and many other sectors. Secondly, for non-tariff measures, the agreement also provides the opportunity for the Indonesian producers to receive what we call as the capacity building to meet the Australian technical and health standards, which otherwise we know that it can be also regarded as the technical barriers in trade. The third thing that I think why then the agreement is important for Indonesia is because the agreement will expand the opportunity for Indonesia to attract the foreign direct investment from Australian, investors. Last but not least, the agreement will also stipulate a prospect for the Indonesian workers to have the internship experience on several sectors such as education, tourism, telecommunication, healthcare, and some other sectors. However, on the other hand, I think I should also need to mention this, that since the agreement is reciprocal, then it means that this agreement, as many other free trade agreements, will also pose a very significant challenge for developing countries like Indonesia. The Indonesian domestic market obviously will be also flooded by the Australian products, right? And in this regard, I think the Indonesian government needs to prepare its producers to be more competitive in this kind of circumstance. Furthermore, in terms of the investor, I think the Indonesian government, in order to be more beneficial, then the Indonesian government has to have a very clear sort of like direction that the priority for the investment should be also in line with Indonesia's like broader development targets, like including the investment in infrastructure, healthcare system, and some other, including, in my opinion, like, renewable energy. So in short, yes, CEPA is important for Indonesia, yet Indonesia has also need to prepare itself to embrace for the impact, and particularly to ensure the benefit out of this kind of agreement.
Yes, and you and I have co-authored a report that's actually, it's been quite well received on IA-CEPA. We published it last year. Ground beneath our feet, rather, has shifted somewhat, right? And now we have the COVID-19 pandemic. 2020's turned out to be a much different year than many of us expected. On that thought, do you think IA-CEPA and trade with Australia has a role with Indonesia's broader post-COVID economic recovery?
Well, as we all aware of the fact that the COVID-19 has provided many countries with the unprecedented challenges, right? One of the reasons behind it is obviously any effort to prevent the spread of the virus through like social and physical distancing will greatly affect the economic activity in many ways in many countries, including also in Indonesia. Something that I think has never had happened before in the large scale like the COVID-19 has brought to us at this moment. So I really hope that the IA-CEPA is expected to you also assisting Indonesia's post-COVID economic recovery. This probably can be done through, the trade and investment relations that I explained earlier, particularly in order to stimulate the small and medium enterprises. And one of the things that important to be mentioned here is the Indonesia's, health care facility is a bit kind of limited. So I'm just thinking probably it will be also good to encourage the investors from Australia to also, invest in that kind of, improving Indonesia healthcare system. Last thing that we also discussed this in our report last year about the economic powerhouse, right? So I think by emphasizing on each other's sort of like competitive advantage, then the two countries may be able to boost the cooperation to penetrate the market access for the third countries in a way that can also contribute for the Indonesia's post COVID economic recovery. Well, fingers crossed,
Yes, fingers crossed indeed. Well, thanks for that update on IA-CEPA. Now I want to shift gears to your analysis brief, which looks at a very different topic. You discuss China's foreign aid diplomacy in the wake of the pandemic. What has China been doing in the aid space now that it has its own domestic outbreak seemingly under control?
Well, yeah, as I also wrote for the analysis, I think as the COVID-19 crisis spreads around the world, China has used what we call as the COVID aid as means to build the diplomatic relationship, right? While China, as you mentioned, has probably so far quite able to manage its domestic kind of outbreak and starting to reopening its economy. But the last news that we saw that some cities in China have already, second wave of the outbreak as well. However, we can also see that China has also started to, assist some other countries in dealing with the virus. And Southeast Asian governments are badly affected by the pandemic, are among the, the leading recipients of the China's aid. This is a very interesting aspect to be observed and analyzed further for the very simple reasons that it comes at the time when ASEAN is attempting to reappraise its position with respect to the US and China, especially considering the situation competition between these two powers. And as I suppose, as China's international response to the COVID crisis has been significantly more effective so far, compared to that of the US, then ASEAN government probably will have a chance to may reapprise their position in the near future regarding their relations with China and the US.
That's great. And you mentioned Southeast Asia, and you discuss other Southeast Asian countries in your analysis brief. How is China's aid received by those countries?
Well, I think we also have to, admit that despite the fact that the global sort of like acceptance of China's COVID aid has been so diverse, some news we learn from some news that some of the tools that sent from China are flows and all those things that can be seen as the reaction for some other countries that more cautious regarding China's aid, right? But for ASEAN particularly, we can see that ASEAN members are much more welcoming. Well, the global level, the skeptical response is understandable because since before the COVID-19 outbreak, there are tensions regarding China's regional, particularly surrounding its Belt and Road Initiative and its behavior in the South China Sea dispute. So some scholars, as I learned so far, have criticized China's aid response as the mask, diplomacy, since now we have to, cover our face, right? So suggesting it's basically, motivated to avert the criticism over its lack of, prudence in the early stage of this pandemic, and also to smooth over the pre-existing political tension. However, back to your question regarding the ASEAN, how then the ASEAN countries receive the China's aid. I think for ASEAN members struggling with the COVID-19, any foreign assistance is going to be much more welcome. Yeah, the latest data from the Southeast Asia COVID-19 tracker, which was provided by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, reveals that there are more than 40,000 cases and has claimed like more than 1,400 lives since its first report on the case. That was the data by the time when I wrote the report. But I checked today, as for today, the numbers are significantly increased already. The cases reported was already like up to like 62,000, almost like 63,000 cases. And the total deaths has reached kind of almost like 2,000 lives, right? So in that sense, as several ASEAN members are developing economies with a very limited public health system, including Indonesia, obviously, so foreign assistance will prove critical, especially in dealing with the spread of the disease, and hopefully can also assist them in, treating the case as this kind of issue are getting, bigger and probably much more problematic in the near future.
And you said Indonesia at this time, in fact, ASEAN even more broadly as well, is trying to decide where it fits kind of in this US-China, in the midst of this US-China tension. Your article, you discuss how China's aid offensive could reshape some of ASEAN's strategic considerations, some of their calculations, particularly their joint ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Why do you think China's aid could prompt that change?
Thank you for that very specific question. Yeah. Before I answer that question, I think I should briefly also mention about the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific and how it very closely related to the current development regarding the China's COVID aid. As you may know, the ASEAN adopted a formal outlook of the Indo-Pacific like last year in June 2019. When ASEAN adopted that outlook, many people say that it was intended sort of to reaffirm the notion of the ASEAN centrality within the Asian regionalism. ASEAN has initiated its own sort of like stance on the Indo-Pacific as a response to not only the US free and open Indo-Pacific, which by me it was considered as the exclusionary towards China, right? At the same time, it was also ASEAN reaction to other visions for the cooperation in the region proposed by Australia, Japan, and India. So it is very important to see why and how the ASEAN has its own outlook on the Indo-Pacific in order, especially at the time when these governments are facing pressure to choose sides between the two economic power. Yeah, so the outlook was thus very important in signaling ASEAN's affirmation of neutrality between US and China. So in this regard, the simple adoption of this term was a very important signal for how ASEAN positions itself within the broader sort of like region. So the debate over China's COVID-8 comes at a time, again, there were already questions regarding ASEAN and China relations, right? So as I mentioned earlier, as China is still struggling domestically, the disease, China has also started to assist the ASEAN countries. At that time, ASEAN also has witnessing kind of the catastrophic failure, if I may say, especially due to Donald Trump, administration as of this pandemic. So consider kind of circumstances then, as I mentioned before, several ASEAN members with a very limited capacity to deal with the virus, China's support is likely to be very beneficial and also well received by these countries. So this kind of situation will, I guess, may intensify ASEAN members' economic dependence towards China. So then that will lead to, I think, the appropriate of the, how then the ASEAN countries will feel politically move closer to China. It may create another pressure for ASEAN to alter its neutrality, because again, now they're becoming more and much more economically dependent on China. So observing this kind of situation, in my opinion, the China support in combating this COVID-19 may also present a geopolitical challenge for ASEAN.
What do you think China's overall objective is with its aid diplomacy in ASEAN?
Well, I think it's quite evident that China's assistance during COVID-19 has been especially very proactive, and we can also argue that this kind of movement sort of like displaying its endeavor to deliver a very strong signal regarding its leadership in the region. Despite the fact that, as we discussed earlier, that its intention is still debatable, whether is it going to be mitigating its early lack of prudence during the first stage of the outbreak or because of something else. It's still, again, debatable. However, what we cannot debate is that China's COVID-8 in ASEAN reveals China's strong presence and engagement in the region. So I guess that's quite obvious. However, I think it's again too soon to tell how these dynamics, will play out. Whether it's going to be, when the crisis has passed, whether it's going to be the same like this or it's going to be very different, we still don't know yet. Whether China's COVID-8 will soften ASEAN members' sort of like attitude towards, its kind of assertive regional role, we still need to be, cautious about it. And it will be very important to monitor how then these governments see other issues, not only about the South China Sea dispute, to assess that to what extent that this kind of China's attitude during the COVID-19 outbreak will completely alters ASEAN countries' acceptance of China's, which then translate into a broader acceptance of China or not. That remains to be, discussed later, and only wait and see what we can say now.
Well, thank you, Poppy. That's a lot of food for thought and very interesting. Our viewers can read Poppy's analysis on our website. We'll put up the link, and they can follow that to read your very insightful and interesting analysis. We want to have you on again for another video interview, hopefully, to discuss IHEPA after it enters into force. We can have a long discussion on that. But thanks again, Poppy, and we really appreciate your time.
Sure, thanks, Kyle.
Thank you.